So today I am going to be sharing a few thoughts about evaluating and choosing a data management system for life science research. And I'm going to be sharing thoughts, and as Steve indicated, hopefully we'll have some discussion around it as well. So please put those questions into the chat or into the Q&A, and we'll address those as we go along. Probably every few slides or so, I'll just kind of take a pause and ask Steve if we have any questions. All right, so I'm going to start with a couple of premises. First one, your data is really valuable. So hopefully this is not new to you. Hopefully you know this, but let's dig into this in a little more detail. If I ask you the question, as an organization, as a research organization or as a research group, what is your most valuable asset? What would you say? Now you might say it's my people. And if you said that, then I'm totally with you. That's what I would say about my organization, about LabKey. But what's second on the list? Hopefully your data is right up there, because you spend a lot of time and a lot of resources and a lot of effort collecting data. The instruments that you purchased and all the service contracts and support and all the the time and effort put into collecting data from those instruments, all the consumables, that must be, the data must be more valuable than what you're putting in to collect that data. Otherwise, why would you be doing it? Likewise, if you're conducting clinical trials or observational studies, those are, of course, very expensive. And ultimately, the goal is that data. You want to get that data. And so I'd at least argue that that data is one of your most valuable assets as an organization. And as a valuable asset, you should secure it, you should protect it, you should manage it, analyze it. You need to be able to share that data. You need to be able to do those things in an efficient and accurate and appropriate manner. And at least I would argue, you need a true data management system, a robust data management system to handle that data, to handle that asset. That is important in the business that we're in. So my second premise, kind of a cliche, I know, but we operate in an ever-changing world. So example number one, pretty easy. Anyone going through a global pandemic right now, or have been over the last year or so? Hopefully we're easing out of it. But that's just an example of one of the changes that you probably didn't predict, at least not with this level of specificity. So, and kind of think back over the last year or so and how your existing data management system handled that shift, handled that change, that pretty dramatic change. On the practical level, was your remote staff able to access your data management system seamlessly? Was your IT team able to manage and sustain that system? Was everything, all the data that you collect and all the data that you need on a daily basis, was that available to everyone wherever they were? That's sort of the pragmatic aspect. And then sort of on a more, on a higher level, how did you as an organization, as a team, as a group, handle the shifts in terms of funding and potentially new research that you were asked to do? We, at LabKey, at least, we know of a lot of groups that had to shift their direction. They were asked to invest in COVID research when they were previously working on other, other immune-related or infectious disease type work, or maybe not even infectious disease work. They were asked to shift and pivot, and were they able to do that? Were their data systems able to make that shift with them? That's sort of an important example of why you need a fairly flexible data management system. So that's one example that nobody really predicted, at least again, not the specifics of that particular pandemic. But there are other shifts and changes that you can predict. I can tell you, if you're here in this webinar, it's quite likely that your lab or your group or your team or your division or company is going to grow and expand. And with your team, your internal and external collaborators are going to grow as well. They're going to shift, there are going to be some changes, people will come and go. But as a growing research organization, more people are going to need access to the data that you collect. And likewise, your research is going to shift in new directions. So new instruments and assays and therapeutic areas. In general, the diversity of data is going to increase as you branch out and explore new areas and do new science. And as we've seen, data volumes are going to grow. And in some cases, they grow exponentially. So case in point, with, LabKey exists today because of a data scalability problem. So Fred Hutch, Cancer Research Center, brought in myself and a couple of others, the co-founders of LabKey, to solve this data scalability problem with mass spectrometry-based proteomics. So there were existing systems, CGI scripts with XSLT that sent all the data, the refined and filtered data directly to a browser. And that worked fairly well for 2,500 rows of data, 5,000 rows of data. But then new instruments came out, the LTQs back in the day, 17, 18 years ago. And those instruments were producing 250,000 rows per run. So in order of magnitude, 50 times, 100 times the amount of data that was there before, and the existing system broke down. And that's fundamentally why we created LabKey, to solve that problem, to create a system that could scale much better than the existing system. Now, we've seen this exponential growth in other areas, RNA sequencing, DNA sequencing, flow cytometry, a lot of these different instruments, there's more data, there's, more information, more lasers, more, larger wells, higher resolution images, all of those factors going into more and more data being produced by these instruments and by your groups. Now, all these things that I've talked about, your group expanding and funding expanding and your impact growing and your research shifting into new areas and more papers and, just in general, more impact. Those are all good things, right? More data is good. If data is valuable, then more data is more valuable. But with these changes come some other things like institutional scrutiny. So your institution, or in some cases regulators, are going to become much more interested, if they're not already, in the data you're collecting, how you're collecting that data. Do you have the controls and the processes and policies in place for compliance and security and privacy and tracking provenance of the data that you're collecting? And also, we're seeing, we've seen over the years from funders an increased demand for the ability to share that data and share the data in meaningful ways. And personally, I think that's just starting. I think the funders are going to become more and more demanding in terms of what form data sharing takes and how making sure that data is useful to others so that your science can be reproduced by others and duplicated, and in general, society can benefit from it. So my takeaway from this slide really is that you need to think about the future. How is, and you can't predict everything, but you can predict some things. The data volumes are going to increase. That the number of users and are going to increase. You need to take those into account when you're evaluating data management systems, so that you don't lock yourself into a system that's not going to grow with you. So this is kind of in some ways, the key slide. You know, if there's one slide you remember, make it this one. We'll talk about each of these points in detail, but you know, the general takeaway is choose a system, evaluate systems, and ultimately choose a system based on scalability and flexibility. That will help you with those future needs. That will make sure that as things shift, your system can shift with it. So you want to anticipate as much as you can these future needs. Can't predict everything, but scalability and flexibility is key. So I've outlined 6 different areas or 6 different axes that I think are useful for evaluating scalability and flexibility of these systems. So first, robust security and compliance controls. I put that first because if you miss the mark on this one, it's game over, right? You can't install a system that doesn't meet the security requirements and the compliant requirements of your institution or of, you know, the regulators in your area. So that's kind of job one. Now, as we talked about, large volumes of diverse data. That's what most research organizations are dealing with, and they're going to get larger and more diverse. So make sure the system can handle a large variety of data, as flexible as possible in the data collection area, and that it can handle it in large volume. And that really means, in order to collect large volumes of data efficiently, you need automation. You need high throughput data acquisition. And that really should be, you know, the system itself should do that work. So you shouldn't have to write programs in order to get data into the system in a high throughput manner. You know, if I have to write the system to load up data, well, why did I buy a system? You know, that system should be able to collect that data automatically for me and provide the help that I need to collect it. Now, once that data is collected, the system really needs to be able to integrate that data. And what I mean by that is not just put it all in a big soup or throw it all into a file system. I mean, provide the capability to join that data by common keys and to be able to do the analysis that you need to do quickly and easily and efficiently and accurately. And that means adding metadata to the system as well. Because if you just have a bunch of data and the system doesn't understand anything about the data, that analysis is going to be much more difficult, very difficult. And so layering in metadata is key along with the data. And then once the data is collected and integrated and perhaps transformed in a variety of different ways, the system needs to be able to provide access to that data through the tools that you and your team and your users want to use. So there shouldn't be limitations as far as you can only use system A to analyze the data out of my data management system, or you can only use, you know, Perl, or you can only use one specific language or one specific tool. The data management system should interact with all of the tools that your constituents want to use. And then the last piece is really about the vendor, the producer of this system. You want to make sure this system is actively developed. It's enhanced on a regular basis. It's not static. And that you have support. You know, this is not just, you know, a shrink wrap package that you pull off the shelf and you install and you're on your own. You need to have a partner, a vendor that supports your work and invests with you. So those are the 6. I'm going to take a pause, I guess, at this point and see if there are any questions yet.
No questions yet, but
Okay.
Don't be shy, folks.
Yeah, if you If you think I'm off base, if you think I've forgotten a key principle, or you don't buy into all these, please speak up. All right, so we'll go into these in a little more detail, starting with, again, number one, security and compliance. So what does it mean to be scalable in the realm of security and compliance? What are some of the keys here? Well, there are, of course, hundreds of controls that I could list as far as security and compliance is concerned. But some of the keys, we really want to make sure these systems integrate with the institutional systems that are out there, institutional systems for authentication and for authorization. So these would typically be things like LDAP and SAML and perhaps CAS for institutional authentication, or maybe two-factor authentication is in place, Duo, or a similar type of system. And also integrating with authorization systems. Again, LDAP is commonly used for security groups, for instance. And so you want to make sure the system can integrate with what's in your institution. Otherwise, it's not going to make its way into the institution. The IT team will most likely not allow that kind of system if it doesn't fit in with existing authentication and authorization. As we talked about, the number of users could be large and will scale up to hundreds or maybe even thousands of users. So your system should be able to handle that and should be able to partition them based on named security groups, so that as an your administrators can can handle this. You need the ability to organize your data and to partition your data however you see fit. Maybe you organize your data by funding, by funding organization, maybe by lab, by study, by experiment, by therapeutic area. It could be anyway. You should have the freedom to organize your data and partition your data so that only the appropriate groups are able to see data in each of those partitions. So you should be able to control access, and importantly, you should be able to report on these decisions so that you can audit, so that you can verify, so that when things change over time, you can, you're confident that you've made the right choices as far as access control. And then, of course, you need a system that supports the appropriate compliance controls that that you're under. So, a few cases in the U.S. at least, HIPAA, FISMA, CFR Part 11. Does the system support robust? First of all, the security controls that are inherent in these regulations. Does it also support robust audit trails and electronic signatures and user management features that are all required? So make sure that you know what regulatory compliance you need to adhere to, and the controls under which that are required by those regulations. Large volumes of data. So, and not just any kind of data, but diverse data. So this means a couple of things. This means bringing together data of a variety of different forms and integrating it together. So as an example, if you're conducting a clinical trial, for instance, you most likely have sample information, instrument data, clinical data, demographic data, and perhaps other different types of data. You need to bring all of that data into one system so that you can analyze it in meaningful ways, efficiently and accurately. So in general, you should be looking for data tables that can have hundreds of columns and potentially millions of rows. In some cases, like back in the proteomics days, we had tables with billions of rows at times. So a system should be able to handle those volumes of data. And importantly, the data types that you use and you interact with, they need to be user definable. You need to be able to customize them and define them. Because, going back to the idea that the kind of data you're collecting is going to be changing quite frequently. So you don't want a system where the vendor says, you can pay us and we will, we will create the data types for you. You need to be able to do that yourself. The system should be able to conform to the data that you collect. And then as you collect all this data, I've said here, I've described it as consistent interaction model. And what I mean by that is you and your team and your constituents, the users of your system, they should be able to learn the system fairly quickly. And whether you're looking at sample information or assay data or clinical data or multiple different types of assays, the user interface and the models that you use to analyze that data and view that data and filter, sort, do ad hoc analysis and formal analysis and create visualizations, that should be the same across all these different data types. So as we talked about, large volumes of data necessitate automation, automated data acquisition. So that's really key for scalable, efficient workflows as you scale up the amount of data that you're collecting. But with that kind of immediately comes the need for quality control. As I'm sure you know, data files are messy. They're not always perfect. Even data files coming off of instruments at times are not clean. So the automation that gets put in place has to support quality control rules and has to support user-defined transformations. So where you say, oh, if you see this kind of data, please transform it into something more standard. So simple example, NAs get translated into nulls, or visit names get mapped to kind of a canonical set of visit names. You need to be able to implement and codify those rules as a part of these workflows. And even with that, things will fail. Machines fail, network connections fail, file systems fail, all kinds of things fail. Permissions fail, it could be user, it could be hardware, but things fail, and you need notifications to inform you that when things have gone poorly. And then you need the ability to fix that and retry. And then even after you get the data in, you need more QC validation, right? After acquisition, you need to be able to view the data, see if there are any problems, and annotate any of those problems and then fix them. And then finally, we talked about partitioning data and providing access to that data. The automation only works and is only efficient if all the data and metadata that gets automatically imported ends up in the right place. So you need a way to make sure that data gets directed to the appropriate partition. So I guess I'll stop and see if there are any questions.
No questions yet.
Okay. So integrating all this disparate data, what that means, as I mentioned before, I gave kind of the clinical trial example earlier, where samples and assays and clinical data are all joined and aligned based on participant and visit. That's sort of the classic clinical trial example, so that I can very easily see clinical data associated with assay data, clinical data associated with the samples that were collected, and write reports and queries that analyze the data with that alignment in mind. So that's an example. Other examples, you need to have a system that is smart enough about this data, and in some cases, now we use clinical ontologies to annotate that data and to be able to make smart connections between data, so that we know, based on clinical ontology concepts that we've annotated, that these data in these separate data sets are really the same thing. They are comparable. We can create a meaningful chart between all of this different data. If the system doesn't have any knowledge about what the data means, then it's a fairly dumb system, right? You need these semantic clues so the system can help you normalize data, harmonize data, and align your data in smart and meaningful ways. So with regard to data analytics, you really need to talk to your constituents. Who's going to be using the system? What tools do they use? What languages do they use? What APIs do they need? You need to get that information first before you do an evaluation of the system and whether it meets those needs. There are some systems that support a single API or a single language. I would stay away from those systems. You want to see, as wide a diversity as possible with regard to downstream analytic tools. So typically there will be, systems will have some built-in reporting, built-in analytics, maybe visualization, statistics, et cetera, which is great. Evaluate that and see how well that stacks up to your needs. But then invariably, no matter what you do, there are those, data scientists and bioinformaticists and data analysts who will want to use their own tool. They'll want to use R or SAS or Tableau or, some other tool, maybe a tool that can be connected via ODBC or JDBC, which are standard APIs. Or maybe they just want to use Python or Java or some other language. Again, assess your needs by talking to your constituents and then look for a system that can address those, that can support those particular tools. All right, so that last point was really about the vendor and whether the system is actively developed. I'm sure you've all seen systems that are out there being sold that are not under active development. They're pretty static. They may be marketed and sold very actively, but the system itself is done. It's been built and nobody's maintaining it. Nobody's enhancing it, certainly. Nobody's developing it. I would suggest you avoid those systems. And if you look at that user interface and it seems tired and hard to use, well, that probably means, the system is also outdated, doesn't have a modern architecture. Probably, it's not going to evolve and grow. It's just a static piece of software. So I would encourage you to engage with a software partner who's really invested in your success, who has incentive to make sure that you meet all your needs and requirements and goals. What you want to look for is a system that has frequent upgrades, good support, has training, has the option of hosting if you need that. If your in-house capabilities, might grow and evolve or might be lacking. You want to see software that is enhanced regularly and has fixes. And, I added this last bullet point here. Again, one of these things we could discuss a little bit, but I'm kind of wary of open-ended pricing models. And what I mean by that is a system that gets more and more expensive the more successful you are. So as you add users, maybe there's a per user licensing model where every user you add, you pay more money. That's friction, right? That's going to make it more difficult for you to be successful because it's going to cost you money. The more successful you are, the more it costs you. So I tend to prefer systems that you purchase them, you make an investment, and that investment pays off and is amortized the more people that use the system. You sort of amortize that cost across all the users. That's my preferred pricing model for these systems. So you might wonder, how do you get answers to all of these questions? I listed a lot of factors that you should be evaluating on, or ideally. So how do you get these answers? Well, you have to ultimately go to the vendor and go to these systems and try them out and ask questions. One of the first places to go, of course, is marketing materials. So the website, the slide decks, the case studies, videos. Do those resources directly address those 6 principles that I outlined? If they don't, that's a huge red flag. Now, let's be clear. These are marketing materials, right? They can say whatever they want to say. And it's much easier to add a bullet point to a website or a slide than it is to actually develop that feature inside of a system. So you can't take it at face value. But what I'm saying here is that if the marketing materials don't even mention security, compliance, scalability, quality control, et cetera, then that's just a huge red flag for you. Okay, what else can you look at? Well, do they make a trial version available that you can just download and use, or you can launch in the cloud and get answers to the questions yourself? If they don't provide that, or if it clearly does not answer those questions, or it's clearly lacking in some of these ways, again, that's a red flag. So another resource, of course, are salespeople. Are they, the salespeople that you're engaged with, are they answering questions? Are they addressing these 6 principles? Are they answering the questions to your satisfaction? Again, if not, that's a red flag. And again, salespeople, they sometimes stretch the truth a little bit. So don't take it on, at face value. But if they don't have an answer for some of these questions, that's certainly a concern. And then one of the last pieces is, and one of the most important ones, I think, are referrals. Does this vendor provide referrals to satisfied customers who can answer the questions that you're asking? That is a great resource. Definitely ask for those. And I'll just say, I know some of the folks on this call today have provided those referrals for us, for LabKey, and huge thank you for doing that. Super valuable to us, but even more valuable to to your colleagues who are evaluating different systems, including LabKey. So we appreciate your efforts there. So this is the only slide where I really talk about KeyServer. And it's not really the focus of this presentation, but you probably won't be surprised to hear that KeyServer stacks up pretty well against these principles. I mean, these are the principles we've been using over the last 17 plus years as we've developed KeyServer and addressed the needs of hundreds of different research organizations. And so, not surprisingly, we have very robust security with the kind of data partitioning and organization that we talked about, role-based access, compliance controls, and integration with institutional systems. We really, as I indicated up front, we've really designed this system from the start with scalability and flexibility at the core. We spent a huge amount of effort on automating data acquisition with multiple QC mechanisms. We have architected the ability to integrate with large volumes of data and really diverse data types. That's a key for LabKey. We call ourselves at times a data integration platform, right? That means bringing many different types of data together and integrating those data in smart ways. And then, more recently in the last year or so, we have added very rich support for clinical ontologies, for both importing clinical ontology information, so actual concepts, clinical concepts as data, but also the ability to annotate all data in the system with clinical concepts. And you get to choose which ontologies you wish to use. It's a very general purpose system. You import the ontologies that are important to you and make use of those within your different partitions of data. We have also invested very heavily in supporting all the popular data analytic systems, all the APIs, all the languages. So all popular languages, JDBC, ODBC, and then, all of the analytic systems like Spotfire and Tableau and Access and Stata, MATLAB, etc. They're all integrated with LabKey so that your constituents, again, can get at the data in the form that makes sense to them. And then, lastly, that team that I mentioned up front, we have 32 engineers working every single day to enhance the LabKey server platform and the LabKey applications to make sure that we're keeping up with the most recent developments, that we're enhancing the system, that we're making it more scalable, more flexible, more performant. We're addressing the needs that each of our clients have and ask us to address. We're doing that. That is really our business. And we have a dedicated services team, really world-class services team that provides all the training and the best practices and the help and support that you need. So that's what I have to share. Again, we'll see if we have any questions at this point.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions. Someone asks, how do we transform the data to medical standards like CDISCs? And
right. So, LabKey, I can kind of speak to LabKey as opposed to other systems. Certainly there are systems out there that have built-in CDISC support. In the case of folks using LabKey, oftentimes they will, this is an important piece about the data analytics and integrations. We have integration with SAS. And so I know several of our clients will use that SAS integration to transform the data into CDISC formats, right? Because SAS has that capability built in. So that's one example. There are other cases where folks will use, a custom script written in, say, Python to transform their data into formats that are important to them. LabKey has a built-in study archive or folder archive format that we've at least talked about using that system or sort of shifting that and adding a provider for CDISC potentially. It's not supported today, but yeah, so I would say today that the most important way is to integrate with some of these other systems that already support those formats.
And I can actually speak to this in my portion. I have a demo which is relevant here. Another question, how does LabKey handle data at scale? Are there upper limits for high throughput data at scale for LabKey?
So yeah, the way we handle that, I mean, there's a whole pipeline in order to get data into the system. So in our case, we oftentimes will use file watchers. I think Steve might be showing some of this.
Yeah.
But as an example, we use a file watcher in order to automate the intake of data without requiring any programming. So that's important. It's important to me. Certainly you can write code to get data into the system, but you don't have to. So using a file watcher, that can kick off a pipeline. And then, first of all, that pipeline needs to be very efficient and high throughput. And so we have invested heavily in the pipeline piece and our data iterator infrastructure in order to very quickly and efficiently get data parsed and transformed, and those QC steps invoked along the way. So it's important to have those, but it's also important that those be efficient. And then, there are decisions to be made that you can make in terms of what data gets actually imported into the relational database on the back end of LabKey versus what data remains in the file system or in S3 or some other blob storage. And that's fairly key, because you don't want to necessarily pull all the raw data into a relational database if you're not going to query it. I always say only put the data into the database if you need to query that data. If you just need to hold raw information or say reads from a sequencer, those can just reside in a file. So making smart decisions about where the data ends up is key. And then for the data that goes into the relational database, that really, we're relying on those relational databases to be efficient and to be scaled up. And fortunately, we largely use Postgres, although we support other databases as well. But Postgres is a good example of a relational database that you can scale up to fairly massive scale if you need to. And that affects both the efficiency of storing the data, but also retrievals. And when we host LabKey on behalf of our clients, we typically host in AWS and use RDS, and we have the ability to scale that up fairly well. So, I'm not taking a lot of credit for that. I mean, that's really on the Postgres side, but you've got some, we're basically leveraging a lot of great database expertise on the part of these other teams. And again, that's a case where we are always keeping up and maintaining LabKey's ability to connect to the latest version of all of these systems, whether it's Java or Tomcat or a relational database like Postgres. We want to make sure we're taking advantage of and giving you the ability to take advantage of the latest and greatest developments by those teams as well.